Hello and welcome to Island Life Stories. This episode is going to be a little bit different. Usually there's somebody sitting on the other side of the screen from me and I get the easy job. I get to ask the questions. I ask people about the decisions they've made, the moments that have changed their lives, what's made them take a chance, what frightened them, what excited them, and whether looking back they'd do it all again. But I suppose there's been one story sitting in the background since I started this podcast that I haven't really told properly. Mine. Or perhaps I should say ours. Because this podcast really came about because of a huge change we made in our own lives. Why we left Wales. Why we ended up on a tiny island in the middle of the South Atlantic. Why we came back much sooner than we'd expected. And strangely enough, why I don't think any of us see coming home as going backwards. Because sometimes you make a huge decision in life and it works out exactly as you planned. And sometimes you make a huge decision in life that takes the plan, screws it up into a ball and throws it out the window. That doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong decision. For years, I had an itch. I don't know where it came from exactly. I just knew there had to be something else out there. We lived in the Welsh valleys, and at one point we moved about 10 miles away. I remember thinking, right, new start. Except apparently 10 miles wasn't far enough. So eventually we moved another 10 miles. Still there. The itch hadn't gone anywhere. And I don't mean that I disliked Wales. That's something I've actually come to understand much better since coming home. It wasn't really about escaping Wales at all. It was about wanting to experience something different. There was always this feeling of, is this it? You work, you pay the bills, Friday comes round, then Monday comes round suspiciously quickly, the seasons change, Christmas comes round again, another year disappears. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with a settled life. In fact, I've developed a much greater appreciation for it. But for me, there was always this little voice asking, what if? What if we went somewhere else? What if we tried something completely different? What if, just once, instead of talking about doing something, we actually did it? That feeling became much stronger during COVID. I think COVID did that to a lot of people. Suddenly the normal routine disappeared and we all had far too much time to think about our lives. People changed careers, people moved house, relationships changed, priorities changed. For me, that itch became much harder to ignore. But wanting to change your life and actually being in a position to change it are two completely different things. We weren't. There were too many things going on. The timing wasn't right. Life wasn't lined up in a way that made something dramatic possible. So the idea stayed where it had always been, in the background. Until last year. Before everything changed, we had one last family holiday together. We went to Switzerland, and looking back now, I'm really glad we did. There was something quite poignant about it. We were together, surrounded by these incredible Swiss mountains, knowing that when the holiday was over, our lives were about to head in completely different directions. There was excitement, there were nerves, there was probably a bit of, what on earth are we doing? But mostly, there was this feeling that something big was about to happen. Because shortly afterwards, the talking stopped. The years of wondering stopped. We finally made the decision. We were going. And we weren't exactly easing ourselves gently into that somewhere different life. We were moving to Saint Helena. If you're listening and you don't know much about Saint Helena, it's a tiny British overseas territory sitting in the South Atlantic Ocean. And it really is sitting out there. Africa is a very long way in one direction. South America is a very long way in the other direction. And in between, you've got an awful lot of Atlantic Ocean. And this extraordinary little island. Most people probably know it, Saint Helena, if they know it at all, because of Napoleon. After Waterloo, the British decided that apparently his previous exile hadn't been quite inconvenient enough. So they sent him somewhere he really wasn't going to escape from. He spent his final years on Saint Helena and died there in 1821. But Saint Helena is so much more than Napoleon. It's volcanic and dramatic and green in places, almost lunar in others. You've got Jamestown squeezed into the incredible valley with historic buildings running down towards the sea. You've got Jacob's Ladder climbing up the hillside. You've got winding roads, enormous views, cloud forest, rugged coastline, and an island that seems capable of changing character completely within a few miles. And of course, you've got the isolation. That isolation is part of what makes Saint Helena so special. It's also part of what makes living there very different from visiting somewhere on holiday. You can't just jump in a car and drive somewhere else. You can't decide on Friday afternoon that you'll pop over to another city for a weekend. You're on an island in the South Atlantic. And oddly enough, that was part of the appeal. This wasn't moving 20 miles down the road again. This was it. If we were going to scratch that itch, we were going to scratch it properly. So we went. There's a massive difference between saying, I'd love to live abroad one day, and standing there surrounded by bags and boxes thinking, oh, we're actually doing this. And I think that's something I've become fascinated by. This gap between thinking and doing, because almost everybody has something they talk about doing. Maybe it's moving abroad, maybe it's leaving a job, maybe it's starting a business, maybe it's ending something that's making them unhappy, maybe it's beginning something they've been frightened to begin. Maybe it's travelling, maybe it's going back to education at 50, maybe it's saying yes to something, maybe it's finally saying no. Whatever it is, there is this enormous psychological gap between I'd love to and I've done it. And crossing that gap changes you. That really is where the idea of this podcast came from. Island Life Stories. When we moved to Saint Helena, I decided I wanted to start a podcast. The original idea was obviously influenced by where we were. I was living on this extraordinary island surrounded by people with fascinating stories, but the idea quickly became bigger than Saint Helena. I realised that what really interested me wasn't necessarily where somebody had gone. It was the decision they'd made to get there. I wanted to talk to people who'd made a big call, people who'd take a chance, people whose lives had changed suddenly through circumstances outside their control, people who deliberately changed direction, people who could look at their lives and identify a line in the sand, a before and after. And I wanted to know what happens in the middle, because we hear success stories all the time. We see the Instagram photograph at the end. We don't always hear about Tuesday afternoon, 6 months earlier, when somebody was sitting in the kitchen table wondering if they'd made the biggest mistake of their life. That's the bit I'm interested in. What actually happens when you make the decision? What happens when the excitement wears off? What happens when reality arrives? What do you learn about yourself? And would you do it again? Since starting Island Life Stories, I've had the privilege of speaking to some genuinely fascinating people. People who've moved countries and continents, people who've changed careers and changed direction, people who found themselves dealing with situations they never expected. People who'd taken risks, followed opportunities, overcome setbacks, or simply decided that the life they had wasn't going to be the life they had forever. Every conversation has been different, and every guest has brought something different to the podcast. Some conversations have made me laugh, some have surprised me, some have made me think about things differently long after we've stopped recording. And that's exactly what I hope this podcast would become, because there's a thread running through so many of these stories. Very few people have everything perfectly worked out when they make a big decision. They don't have a crystal ball. They're not necessarily braver than everybody else. They've just reached the point where staying where they are feels like a bigger decision than moving. And while I was sitting there asking people those questions, our own story was changing again. When we went to Saint Helena, we certainly didn't go there thinking we'd be back in Wales again shortly afterwards. That wasn't the plan. But life has an annoying habit of not reading your plans. Circumstances back home changed because of illness within the family. Suddenly, there were things happening thousands of miles away that mattered enormously to us. And being thousands of miles away started to feel very different. At first, you try to make it work. You adapt, you look for solutions, you tell yourself that things will settle down. You do everything you reasonably can because you've made this huge move, you've built a life, you've committed to something, and you don't want to give it up at the first hurdle. And for quite a while, that's what we did. We tried to find a version of the plan that still worked. Maybe we could change this, maybe we could rearrange that, maybe we could stay and manage things differently. But slowly we started to realize something. We weren't dealing with a temporary inconvenience anymore. Our circumstances had changed. And once you accept that, you have another decision to make. Do you keep forcing the old plan to work because you've invested so much into it, or do you accept that the plan has changed? That's harder than it sounds, because leaving something can feel like failure, especially when you've told everybody you're doing it. You've made the big announcement, you've packed everything up, you've moved thousands of miles, and then you're saying, we're coming home. It would have been very easy to see that as defeat, but I don't. Not anymore. Eventually, we made the decision to return to Wales, indefinitely. And something happened that I genuinely wasn't expecting. The itch had gone. The itch I'd had for years. The one that moving 10 miles hadn't cured. The one that moving another 10 miles hadn't cured. The one that got stronger during COVID. The one that eventually took us thousands of miles into the South Atlantic. Gone. And that's when I realised something. Maybe the itch was never telling me that I needed to live somewhere else forever. Maybe it was just telling me that I needed to go. I needed to find out. There's a huge difference. If we'd never gone, I think I'd still be wondering. I'd still be looking at opportunities. I'd still be saying, one day. I'd probably still have this idea that somewhere else had an answer to a question I couldn't quite define. Now I know. We did it. We lived on a remote island. We stepped completely outside our normal lives. We experienced something that most people will never experience, and then circumstances changed and we came home. But we didn't come home as the same people who left. One of the strangest things about coming back has been looking at Wales differently. Things that were ordinary before don't feel quite as ordinary anymore. We're exploring, we're noticing places, we're appreciating what's on our doorstep, and I think distance gives you perspective. You can spend years looking outward, convinced that adventure exists somewhere else. Then you travel thousands of miles, come back, and suddenly start noticing what's been sitting around you all along. Wales is an extraordinary country. The mountains, valleys, coastline, castles, history, villages, cities, and the sheer variety packed into such a relatively small place. We're seeing more of it now, and perhaps more importantly, we're looking at it. There's a difference between living somewhere and actually seeing it. I don't think I did before. I think all of us have changed. Not in some dramatic Hollywood way, we're still us, but our perspective is different. We're more adaptable. We're probably less frightened of change, and we've learned that life can change very quickly and you can cope with far more uncertainty than you think you can. We've also learned that change in your mind isn't failure. Change in direction isn't failure. Coming home isn't failure. Sometimes the bravest decision is going. Sometimes it's staying. And sometimes it's knowing when it's time to come back. There is one thing I couldn't make this episode without talking about. The people of Saint Helena. The saints. It's very difficult to describe a community without falling into cliches about everybody being friendly and welcoming, but Saint Helena genuinely deserves more than a passing mention. We arrived as outsiders, and the warmth we experienced there is something I don't think any of us will forget. People made time for us, people helped us, people welcomed us, people stopped to talk. There is a sense of community there that is increasingly difficult to find. And when our circumstances changed, that kindness mattered even more. Saint Helena isn't perfect, nowhere is. Island life has challenges. Isolation has challenges. Living in a small community has challenges. But the people make that island what it is. And I feel incredibly lucky that for a period of our lives, however much shorter than we'd originally imagined, we got to call Saint Helena home. It will always be part of our family's history. There are people there I hope will remain part of our lives for many, many years. And I would encourage anybody who ever gets the opportunity to visit Saint Helena to take it. It's one of those rare places that still feels genuinely different. Not manufactured different, not packaged for tourists different, actually different. And I'm incredibly grateful that we experienced it. So what now? That's the question, isn't it? What now? And the truthful answer is, we're working that out. We're settling back into life in Wales. We're rebuilding routines. We're deciding what the next chapter looks like. But we're doing it without that burden that I've carried for years. I don't feel trapped. I don't feel that there's something I haven't done. I don't feel like I'm waiting for my real life to start somewhere else. And that's incredibly freeing. Does that mean we'll never move again? I've learned not to make statements like that. Life might be listening. But right now I'm happy to be here. And I'm excited about what's next. Especially with this podcast. Because if anything, everything that's happened has made me even more interested in the conversations we're having on Island Life Stories. I've discovered firsthand that a big life decision doesn't have to end the way you imagined for it to have been the right decision. Sometimes the value is in making it. Sometimes the destination isn't really the point. It's the person you become because you went. And that's what I want to explore more. I want to speak to more people who've done extraordinary things, and ordinary people who've made extraordinary decisions. People who've left careers, started again, moved around the world, come home, taken risks, recovered from things they didn't choose, built businesses, changed their priorities, followed dreams, abandoned dreams that no longer suited them and found better ones, because I think those stories can help the rest of us. Not by telling people you should quit your job and move to a remote island in the South Atlantic. Please don't blame me for that. But by reminding people that we have more agency in our lives than we sometimes realise. And also that when something happens that takes that agency away from us, we can adapt. Plans are plans. We're not contracts. Was it worth it? If you'd asked me a couple of years ago what I wanted, I probably would have said, I want to get away. I don't feel like that anymore. And maybe that's the greatest thing Saint Helena gave me. We went looking for something. I'm not even sure I knew what it was. But whatever the itch was, we scratched it. And we're home. Not because the adventure failed. We're home because the adventure happened. That's a completely different thing. So if you're listening to this with your own itch, whatever it might be, I'm not going to tell you to pack your bags tomorrow, but perhaps ask yourself what it's trying to tell you. Maybe you need to make a huge change. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just need to know you've properly considered it. But don't automatically assume that the safest decision is doing nothing. Doing nothing is a decision too. And if you do take the leap, remember that you're allowed to change the plan afterwards. Life changes. People change. Priorities change. Success isn't sticking rigidly to a decision you made when your circumstances were completely different. Sometimes success is having enough confidence to say, that was right for us then, this is right for us now. For us, right now, that's Wales. And it feels good to be home. But I'll always be grateful to that little island in the South Atlantic, and especially to the people who welcomed us to their home while we worked all of this out. And as for Island Life Stories, we're only getting started. I've already had conversations I never imagined I'd be having when I first had the idea for this podcast. And there are plenty more to come. More people, more decisions, more adventures. More moments when somebody decided to say yes, or decided that actually it was time to say no. Hopefully their stories might inspire somebody listening to make their own decision, whatever that decision might be. And before I go, I'm going to ask you for a couple of things. If you've enjoyed Island Life Stories so far, please follow or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. It really does help, and it means you'll know when the next conversation is released. And if you know somebody who's standing at one of those crossroads in life at the moment, somebody thinking about making a change, taking a chance, or starting again, send them this episode. Maybe there's something in our story, or in one of the other stories in the podcast, that they need to hear. And finally, I know there are thousands of incredible stories out there that I've yet to discover. So if you've made a big decision that changed the direction of your life, or something happened that forced you to completely rethink the future you'd planned, I'd love to hear from you. Get in touch with Island Life Stories. You don't have to be famous. You don't need to have climbed Everest, sailed around the world, or become a millionaire. You just need a story. Because I'm increasingly convinced that some of the most interesting stories belong to people who would never think of themselves as interesting. Thank you to everyone who's listened so far. Thank you to everyone who's supported the podcast. Thank you to every guest who's trusted me with their story. And a very special thank you to Saint Helena and the Saints. You gave us an adventure. You gave us memories. You gave us friends. And without intending to, you helped me finally scratch an itch I'd had for years. We might be back in Wales, but we're looking at the world a little differently now. And I think that's what a real adventure is supposed to do. I'm Darren. This is Island Life Stories, and I'll see you next time.